whether it's a reference to a U.S. person, as an example in a scenario. In our reporting, then, we will mask the identity of the individual. We'll use a phrase like U.S. person 1 or U.S. person 2. And I remind everyone that for our purposes, U.S. person is defined very broadly. That is not just a U.S. citizen. That is a U.S. corporation. That is a ship or aircraft that is registered in the United States. That is an internet protocol address, for example. So it's not just a particular individual, if that makes sense. The term for us is much broader because it's designed to ensure our protections of U.S. persons.
And those, the procedures and protections you talked about are required and approved by the FISA court. Is that correct?
Yes, sir, and the Attorney General. And
you mentioned in your opening statement that for that kind of information to be disseminated outside of your agency and the NSA, that dissemination would be strictly on a need-to-know basis. Is that correct?
We use 2 criteria. Is there a need to know in the course of the person or group that is asking for the identification? Is there a valid need to know in the course of the execution of their official duties?
So, who would that be?
It could be another element with the intelligence community. It could be another element within NSA. It could be a military customer, for example, who's reading some of our reporting. It could be a policymaker. I apologize. There was one other point that I wanted to make, but I've lost the thread in my mind. I apologize. If I jump in a moment, I'll try to.
Let's get back to masking briefly. You spoke about masking and trying to keep a U.S. Person's identity concealed, and when it is disseminated, we often talk about in the intelligence community about the exceptions to if somebody's masks, how you unmask them. What would the exceptions to that masking be before it's disseminated?
So again, we use 2 criteria: the need to know on the person requesting us and the execution of their official duties, and the second part was, is the identification necessary to truly understand the context and the intelligence value that the report is designed to generate? Those are the 2 criteria we use.
Is that identity of a U.S. person communicating with a foreign target, is that ordinarily disseminated in a masked or unmasked form?
No, it is normally disseminated. If we make the decision that there's intelligence value and we're going to report on it, it is normally disseminated in a masked form. I would, again, as I said, we'll use a reference: U.S. person 1, U.S. person 2. I would highlight, if you look at the total breadth of our reporting involving U.S. persons at all is an incredibly small subset, in my experience, of our total reporting.
Who normally in the NSA would make the
delegated this authority to approve unmasked requests?
And does the level of approval change depending on the reason for unmasking? If it was something or somebody, say, really important, would that matter? Or could it be?
It's not necessarily designated in writing that way, certainly by custom and tradition. At times, requests will be pushed up to on the senior most of the 20 individuals. Requests will be pushed to my level, saying, "Hey, sir, we just want to make sure that you're comfortable with this."
So, 20 people. What procedures or safeguards are put in place to make sure that those 20 people are not unmasking, wrongly?
So they retrieve specific training. There are specific controls put in place in terms of our ability to disseminate information out of the databases associated with U.S. persons.
Okay. Run through the exceptions quickly through a following hypothetical. If the NSA collects a communication where a target under surveillance is talking to a U.S. person, how would the NSA determine whether disseminating the U.S. person information is necessary to understanding the foreign intelligence or assess its importance?
So first, we'll try to understand the nature of the conversation. Is this truly something that involves intelligence or a national security implication for the United States, or is this just very normal, reasonable conversations, in which case we have no desire to have any awareness of it? It's not applicable to our mission. And I said in that case, normally we'll purge the data. We'll ask ourselves, is there criminal activity involved? Is there potential threat or harm to U.S. individuals being discussed in the conversation, for example?
If there was criminal activity involved, what would you do then?
When we disseminate, if we decide if it's criminal activity, we'll disseminate the information. If the FBI or other criminal activities are on the reporting stream, in some cases, I also will generate a signed letter under my signature in specific cases to Department of Justice, highlighting that what we think we have is potential criminal activity, but because we are not a law enforcement or justice organization, we're not at a place to make that determination.
Okay, based on that, again, hypothetically, if the NSA obtained the communication of General Flynn while he was communicating with a surveillance target legally, would you please explain how General Flynn's identity could be unmasked based on the exceptions that we discussed?
Sir, I'm not going to discuss even hypotheticals about individuals. I'm sorry.
If I could make reference to a Washington Post article that I have here from February 9th, which states, let me say what it is and I'll ask if you've read it or if you've seen it, which states national security under Michael Flynn privately discussed U.S. sanctions against Russia with the country's ambassador to the United States during the month before President Trump took office, contrary to public assertions by Trump officials. Current and former U.S. officials said. The article goes on to say that 9 current or former officials who were in senior positions at multiple agencies at the time of the call spoke under the condition of anonymity to discuss intelligence matters. Did you read this article?
I apologize. Not an article that references 9 particular individuals. It doesn't necessarily ring a bell. I've certainly seen plenty of media reporting to that, but again, I'm not going to comment on specifics.
Just basically, under the breadth of that article, when we hear that 9 former current officials had spoken to the press under the condition of anonymity, and we heard Director Comey and the chairman speak of this as a potential crime, a serious crime under the who would be in a position to request the unmasking of General Flynn's identity? Would that be you?
I would have the authority to do that.
Who else would?
The 19 other individuals.
Would that include Director Comey?
I'm talking about
in the NSA alone,
within the National Security Agency, and we're talking about NSA reporting.
But would people like Director Comey also be able to request that?
Yes.
And the Attorney General and Director Clapper, are those type of people also on this list?
Again, I'm not going to talk. In general, yes, they would be.
Generally
able to come
speaking,
and ask.
not with regard.
Be able to come and ask. Not going to talk about the specifics of an individual or hypothetical scenarios.
Well, here's what I'm trying to get at. If what we're talking about is a serious crime, as has been alleged, in your opinion, would leaking of a U.S. person who has been unmasked and disseminated by intelligence community officials, would that leaking to the press hurt or help our ability to conduct national security matters? Okay, if it hurts, so this leak, which through the 702 tool, which we all agree is vital, or you and I at least agree to that, do you think that leak actually threatens our national security? If it's a crime, and if it's unveiling a masked person, and this tool is so important that it could potentially jeopardize this tool when we have to try to reauthorize it in a few months, if this is used against the ability of us to reauthorize this tool, and we can't get it done because whoever did this leak, or these 9 people that did this leak, create such a stir, whether it be, in our legislative process or whatever, that they don't feel confident that a U.S. person under the 702 program can be masked successfully and not security.
Yes, sir.
Can you think of any reason why somebody would want to leak the identity of a masked person?
No, sir. I mean, I have raised this directly with my own workforce over the course of the last few months to remind everyone part of the ethics of our profession, not just the legal requirement, but the ethics of our profession as intelligence professionals, is we do not engage in this activity. And I've also reminded the men and women of the National Security Agency, if I become aware of any such conduct, there is no place for you on this team. It's acceptable to citizens of the nation.
Well, I think that, as we move forward, obviously, I think that what you're speaking of is this sacred trust that the intelligence community has with the American people and with the people that are representing them here on this dais. And I think that it's vital that for those who break that sacred trust, if they are not held accountable, whether it by the NSA internally or by the FBI through conviction or investigation / prosecution and / conviction through the Attorney General's office of that crime, it is very difficult for us to be able to keep that sacred trust, to know that what we're doing is valid and what we're doing has no nefarious motivations, and to us to be able to keep America safe without violating the constitutional protections that we all enjoy. Mr. Chairman, I'm not sure how much more time I have left. I just wanted to...
Congressman, can I make one comment if I could? I apologize. It comes to my mind based on your question. I just want to remind everyone that in general, FISA collection on targets in the United States has nothing to do with 702. I just want to make sure we're not confusing the two things here. 702 is collection overseas against non-U.S. persons.
Right, and what we're talking about here is, incidentally, if a U.S. person is talking to a foreign person that we're listening to, whether or not that person is unmasked.
I just want to make sure we understand the context, that's all.
And whether or not somebody in the intelligence community that we put the trust in is going to leak that information to the press for whatever reason. And I'm not going to get into the gratuitous, what that reason may be. But it's really going to hurt the people on this committee and you all in the intelligence community when we try to retain this tool this year and trying to convince some of our colleagues that this is really important for national security. When somebody in the intelligence community says, you know what, the hell with it, I'm going to release this person's name because I'm going to get something out of it. We're all going to be hurt by that if we can't reauthorize this tool. Do you agree with that?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Chair, do I have enough time to talk about the letter that the committee sent? The committee sent to you on March 15th a letter to Admiral Rogers and to Director Comey. Have you had a chance to look at this letter? I think that you've actually... Yes,
sir. I, in fact, have given you a reply on the 17th.
Just real quickly, because I don't want to take up any more time. Can you give us a sense of how many unmasked U.S. persons' identities were disseminated by the NSA from June 2016 to June 2017?
No, sir. As I have indicated, we're in the process of compiling that information. I will provide it to the committee, but until that work is done, I am not going to comment.
Can you tell us whether any of those disseminations broadly involved U.S. people relating to presidential candidates Donald J. Trump or Hillary Clinton and their associates in 2016?
I won't answer until I complete the research, sir.
Assuming that the NSA disseminated unmasked U.S. persons' information relating to the Trump or Clinton campaigns, would that have been a reason for such unmasking?
I apologize. I don't truly understand the question.
Let me just move on to the next one.
Right.
Along those lines, if the NSA had wanted to disseminate unmasked U.S. persons' information related to either the presidential campaign, who in the NSA would have approved such disseminations?
Again, it would have been one of the... And I provided that in my initial response to the committee. I've outlined the procedures. I've outlined the specific 20 individuals.
Thank you, Admiral. I appreciate your answers. I look forward to working with you on the subcommittee moving forward. And Mr. Chairman,
Chairman, Director Comey, we will begin this line of questioning, then we'll finish it the next round. FISA and other similar related counterterrorism programs have been described even this morning as vital, critical, and indispensable to our national security. And many of us on both sides of the aisle believe FISA and similar counterterrorism programs prevent terrorist attacks and save American lives. But FISA and other surveillance programs are intentionally designed to preserve preserve the privacy of U.S. citizens. They are intentionally designed to ensure the information is collected and used only for legitimate national security and criminal investigative purposes. There are statutory safeguards. There are warrants based on probable cause. There is a FISA court that is involved. There are audits on the back end, and we think so highly of this material. It is a felony punishable by up to 10 years in federal prison to unlawfully disseminate it. All of this was done to make sure this information gathered remains protected as it relates to U.S. citizens. The way I view it, Director Comey, the American people have an agreement with their government. We are going to give you the tools to keep us safe, even if it infringes on our privacy some. We're going to give you the tools. And government in return promises to safeguard the privacy of U.S. citizens. And when that deal is broken, it jeopardizes American trust in these surveillance programs. So let me ask you, do you agree FISA is critical to our national security?
I do.
Do you agree programs like FISA were intentionally designed to safeguard the identity of U.S. persons?
Yes, there are other important elements of it, but that's the primary goal, I believe.
It wasn't an afterthought. It wasn't an accident. These are intentional safeguards that we put in place to protect U.S. citizens. Is that correct?
Correct.
Do you agree much of what is learned from these programs is classified or otherwise legally protected?
All FISA applications, review by the court, collection by us pursuant to our FISA authority is classified.
The dissemination of which is a felony punishable by up to 10 years in prison?
Sure, dissemination, unauthorized dissemination.
Unauthorized dissemination of classified or otherwise legally protected material punishable by a felony up to 10 years in federal prison.
Yep, yes, as it should be.
All right. According to a senior U.S. government official, a named U.S. citizen, and I will not use the name, a named U.S. citizen, phoned the Russian ambassador several times on December the 29th. In February of this year, the Washington Post reported nine current and former officials who were in senior positions at multiple agencies at the time of the call spoke on the condition of anonymity to discuss intelligence matters, and that officials began poring over intelligence reports, intercepted communications, and diplomatic cables. In February of this year, the New York Times reported a U.S. citizen, whose name I will not use, discusses sanctions with the Russian ambassador in a phone call, according to officials who have seen a transcript of the wiretapped conversation. And again in February of this year, the New York Times reported on a phone call involving a U.S. citizen, including significant discussions of phone records, intercepted calls, intercepted communications, and reported the NSA captured calls and then asked the FBI to collect as much information as possible. My time is up, so I will say this for this round. I thought it was against the law to disseminate classified information. Is it?
Oh, yes, sure, it's a serious crime. I'm not going to comment on those particular articles because I don't want to, in any circumstance, compound a criminal act by confirming that it was classified information. But in general, yes, it's a serious crime, and it should be, for the reasons you said.
We'll take it back up next round, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. I'll now yield 15 minutes to Mr. Schiff.
Director Comey, I want to begin by attempting to put to rest several claims made by the President about his predecessor. namely that President Obama wiretapped his phones. So that we can be precise, I want to refer you to exactly what the President said and ask you whether there is any truth to it. First, the President claimed, quote, "Terrible. Just found out that Obama had my wires tapped in Trump Tower just before the victory. Nothing found. This is McCarthyism," unquote. Director Comey, was the President's statement that Obama had his wires tapped in Trump Tower a true statement?
With respect to the President's tweets about alleged wiretapping directed at him by the prior administration, I have no information that supports those tweets, and we have looked carefully inside the FBI. The Department of Justice has asked me to share with you that the answer is the same for the Department of Justice and all its components. The Department has no information that supports those tweets.
The President accused Mr. Obama and presumably the FBI of engaging in McCarthyism. As you understand the term McCarthyism, do you think President Obama or the FBI was engaged in such conduct?
I'm not going to try and characterize the tweets themselves. All I can tell you is we have no information that supports them.
Were you engaged in McCarthyism, Director Comey?
Try very hard not to engage in any isms of any kind, including McCarthyism.
The President second stated, quote, "Is it legal for a sitting president to be wiretapping a race for president prior to an election? Turned down by a court earlier, a new low," unquote. Director Comey, can you answer the President's question? Would it be legal for President Obama to have ordered a wiretap of Donald Trump?
I'm not going to characterize what I were just saying. There is a statutory framework in the United States under which courts grant permission for electronic surveillance, either in a criminal case or a national security case, based on a showing of probable cause, carefully overseen. It's a rigorous process that involves all three branches of government, and it's one we've lived with since the late 1970s. That's how it works. So no individual in the United States can direct electronic surveillance of anyone. It has to go through an application process, ask a judge. The judge can then make the order.
So President Obama could not unilaterally order a wiretap of anyone?
No president could.
Mr. Trump also asserted in that tweet that that the application or the President's order was turned down by a court. Was there any request made by the FBI or Justice Department to wiretap Donald Trump turned down by a court?
That's one of those subjects I can't comment on one way or another. Please don't interpret that in any way other than I just can't talk about anything that relates to the FISA process in an open setting.
Third, the President stated, "I'd bet a good lawyer could make a great case out of the fact that President Obama was tapping my phones in October just prior to the election." Director Comey, you're a good lawyer. Can you make out a great case that President Obama wiretapped Mr. Trump's phones just prior to the election, in light of the fact you have said there's no evidence of that?
All I can say is what I said before, that we don't have any information that supports those tweets.
Well, in my view, then, you would not be a great but a very unethical lawyer to make out such a case. And finally, the President made the following accusation: "How low has President Obama gone to tap my phones during the very sacred election process? This is Nixon Watergate, bad or sick guy." Director Comey, the President has compared Mr. Obama to Nixon and purported wiretap of Trump phones as another Watergate. What was the gravamen of the offense by Nixon and his operatives during Watergate? A lot of people who may be watching may be too young to understand what Watergate was about. What was the gravamen of that offense?
Well, as I recall it, and I was a kid but have studied it quite a bit in school, the gravamen of it was an abuse of power, including break-ins, unlawful wiretaps, obstruction of justice, sort of the cycle of criminal conduct.
And it was a break-in of the Democratic headquarters by operatives of the President, was it not?
That's my understanding. Is that's how it began. The
and it
investigation
also
began.
Involved a cover-up by the President.
Yes, as I said.
Now here I think you've said there's been no evidence of an illegal wiretap by President Obama. Is that right?
I've said the FBI and the Department of Justice have no information to support those tweets.
But evidence, is there not, of a break-in of the Democratic headquarters by a foreign power using cyber means?
Yes, there was. As the intelligence community report, the unclassed report said in January, the Russian intelligence services hacked into a number of enterprises in the United States, including the Democratic National Committee.
And there was an effort by the Russians to cover up their break-in of the Democratic Party headquarters by using cutouts like WikiLeaks to publish the stolen material. Isn't that right?
Certainly to cover up that they were the ones releasing it.
Director Rogers, in an effort to explain why there was no evidence, the President and his spokesman, Sean Spicer, have suggested that British intelligence, through its NSA or GCHQ, wiretapped Mr. Trump on President Obama's behalf. Did you ever request that your counterparts in GCHQ should wiretap Mr. Trump on behalf of President Obama?
No, sir, nor would I. That would be expressly against the construct of the Five Eyes agreement that's been in place for decades.
And the Five Eyes are some of our closest intelligence partners, and Britain is one of them.
Yes, sir.
Have you seen any evidence that anyone else in the Obama administration made such a request?
No, sir. And again, my view is the same as Director Comey. I've seen nothing on the NSA side that we engaged in any such activity, nor that anyone ever asked us to engage in such activity.
And if you were to ask the British to spy on America, that would be a violation of U.S. law, would it not?
Yes, sir.
Our relationship with British intelligence is one of the closest we have with any foreign services. Isn't that true?
Yes, sir.
Now, our British allies have called the President's suggestion that they wiretapped him for Obama nonsense and utterly ridiculous. Would you agree?
Yes, sir.
Does it do damage to our relationship with one of our closest intelligence partners for the President to make a baseless claim that the British participated in a conspiracy against him?
I think it clearly frustrates a key ally of ours.
Certainly wouldn't endear the British intelligence services to continue working with us, would it?
I believe that the relationship is strong enough. This is something we'll be able to deal with.
But it's not helpful.
Yes, sir.
Director Rogers, President Trump recently met with German Chancellor Angela Merkel. During a joint press conference, the President suggested that they both had something in common, that they had both been wiretapped by President Obama. Director Comey has just demonstrated why the claims by the President about his being wiretapped by Obama were unsupported by any evidence. But the claim he made about wiretapping directed at Merkel referred to something that came up in the context of the Snowden disclosures. I'm not going to ask you to comment on whether the Chancellor was the subject of any eavesdropping, but I would like to ask you whether the Snowden disclosures did damage to our relationship with our German ally, and whether the Chancellor herself expressed her concern at the time.
Yes, sir.
In light of this, is it helpful to our relationship with the Chancellor or our relationship with German intelligence to bring this up again in a public forum?
It certainly complicates things, but again, I'd like to think that our relationship is such we're going to be able to deal and keep moving forward.
So our relationships with the British and the Germans, you hope, are strong enough to withstand any damage done by these comments?
By anything in general, sir. We have foundational interests with each other. We need to keep working together.
This time, Director Comey, let me ask you a few questions you may or may not be able to answer. Do you know who Roger Stone is?
Generally, yes.
Are you aware that he was a partner of Paul Manafort?
You know, Mr. Schiff, I'm worried we're going to a place I don't want to go, which is commenting on any particular person. And so I don't think I should comment. I'm aware of public accounts, but I don't want to talk more than that.
Are you aware that he has publicly acknowledged having directly communicated with Guccifer II, someone that the intelligence community has assessed was a persona of Russian intelligence?
I've read media accounts to that effect. I don't want to hurt anybody's feeling in the media. I don't know whether that's accurate or not.
If Mr. Stone acknowledged that Mr. Podesta's time in the barrel was coming in August of 2016, Would that have been prior to the public release of stolen emails of Mr. Podesta's?
I believe that's correct chronology.
Do you know how Mr. Stone would have known that Mr. Podesta's emails were going to be released?
It's not something I can comment on.
Do you know that Mr. Podesta has said that it's published?
It's not something I can comment on.
At this point, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to yield to Mr. Himes.
Thank you to the ranking member. And gentlemen, thank you for being with us today. Let me, when I get my own time, I'll have some follow-up questions, but let me start with a point that the chairman brought out, I think, very specifically, which is that there's no evidence that votes were technically changed in any of the jurisdictions that he named. Admiral Rogers, thanks for confirming that. But am I correct that when we say Russian hacking, what we are referring to is the fact that the intelligence community believes that the Russians penetrated the networks of the DNC, of John Podesta and other individuals, stole information, and then disseminated that information? Is that a fair characterization of the conclusions of the intelligence community?
Yes, sir.
And did the intelligence community ever do an analysis as to whether the dissemination of that adverse information in a closely fought election had any effect on the American electorate?
No, sir. The U.S. intelligence community does not do assessments of
course not.
policy
That's not your job.
Yes, sir.
In fact, as those of us who go through campaigns know, that's actually something we probably have a little bit more understanding of. Let me just ask this question then. Was there any equivalent dissemination of adverse information stolen from the RNC or individuals associated with the Trump campaign?
No.
Thank you. Director Comey, in the remaining minutes here, I appreciate your frankness on the topic of an ongoing investigation and appreciate your inability to go too much further than you went. But I do want to ask you a question to try to clear up some confusion. This committee, of course, is engaged in an investigation about links, as you said, between the Trump campaign and the Russians, should there be any possible collusion. We've had a number of statements very early in the investigation that there was no evidence of collusion. This is still very early in our investigation. Is it fair to say that you're still relatively early in your investigation?
It's hard to say because I don't know how much longer it will take, but we've been doing this. This investigation began in late July, so for a counterintelligence investigation, that's a fairly short period of time.
So you use the word coordination, which to me suggests that you are in fact investigating whether there was coordination between U.S. persons and the Russians. Is it fair for me to assume that we shouldn't simply dismiss the possibility that there was coordination or collusion between the Russian efforts and U.S. persons as an investigatory body?
All I can tell you is what we're investigating, which includes whether there was any coordination between people associated with the Trump campaign and the Russians.
Okay, thank you. I'll yield the remaining time to the ranking member.
I will yield the remaining time in this period to Representative Sewell.
Thank you. So, with respect to the coordination, Director Comey, I just wanted to continue this line of questioning. Can you say with any specificity what kind of coordination or contacts you're looking at in your investigation generally when confronted with something like this?
I can't.
Can you discuss whether or not there was any knowledge by any Trump-related? So, with respect to any investigation, ongoing investigation, whether the specificity of the person, U.S. person or otherwise, you can't comment on any of that?
Correct.
Okay. Can you characterize what the nature of your investigation generally, when you do an investigation of this sort, can you talk a little bit about the process generally?
Not a whole lot. I can tell you we use our great people. We coordinate with our brothers and sisters in other parts of the intelligence community to see what they may know from around the world that might be useful to us. And we use all the different tools and techniques that we use in all of our investigations. That's probably the most, I'm not sure that's useful to you, but that's the most I can say.
How long does a counterintelligence investigation like this usually take? You said that it started in July.
There is no usually. It's impossible to say, frankly.
I yield back my time.
Thank you, Ms. Sewell. We'll go back to, I'll yield myself 15 minutes and we'll go back to Mr. Gowdy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Comey, you and I were discussing the felonious dissemination of classified material during the last round. Is there an exception in the law for current or former U.S. officials who request anonymity?
To release classified information?
Yes, sir.
No.
Is there an exception in the law for reporters who want to break a story?
Well, that's a harder question as to whether a reporter incurs criminal liability by publishing classified information, and one probably beyond my ken. I'm not as good a lawyer as Mr. Schiff said I used to be.
Well, I don't know about that, but the statute does use the word publish, doesn't it?
It does, but that's a question I know the Department of Justice has struggled with through administration after administration.
I know the department struggled with it, the Fourth Circuit struggled with it, lots of people have struggled with it, but you're not aware of an exception in the current dissemination of classified information statute that carves out an exception for reporters.
No, I'm not aware of anything carved out in the statute. I don't think a reporter has been prosecuted, certainly in my lifetime, though.
Well, there have been a lot of statutes that bar in this investigation for which no one's ever been prosecuted or convicted, and that does not keep people from discussing those statutes, namely the Logan Act. In theory, how would reporters know a U.S. citizen made a telephone call to an agent of a foreign power?
How would they know legally?
Yes.
If it was declassified and then discussed in a judicial proceeding or a congressional hearing, something like that.
And assume none of those facts are at play, how would they know?
Someone told them who shouldn't have told them.
How would a reporter know about the existence of intercepted phone calls?
Well, same thing. In a legitimate way, through an appropriate proceeding where there's been declassification. In any other way, in an illegitimate way.
How would reporters know if a transcript existed of an intercepted communication?
Same answer. The only legitimate way would be through a proceeding.
What does the term mask mean in the concept of FISA and other surveillance programs?
As Director Rogers explained, it's our practice, approved by the FISA court, of removing the names of U.S. persons to protect their privacy and their identity unless it hits certain exceptions. So masking means, as Mike Rogers said, I'll often see an intelligence report from NSA that will say U.S. person number 1, U.S. person number 2, U.S. person number 3, and there's no further identification on the document.
Admiral Rogers said there are 20 people within the NSA that are part of the unmasking process. How many people within the FBI are part of the unmasking process?
I don't know for sure. As I sit here, surely more, given the nature of the FBI's work. We come into contact with U.S. persons a whole lot more than the NSA does, because we may be conducting, we only conduct our operations in the United States to collect electronic surveillance, to conduct electronic surveillance. So I can find out the exact number. I don't know it as I sit here.
Well, I think, Director Comey, given the fact that you and I agree this is critical, vital, indispensable, a similar program is coming up for reauthorization this fall with a pretty strong headwind right now. It would be nice to know the universe of people who have the power to unmask a U.S. citizen's name, because that might provide something of a roadmap to investigate who might have actually disseminated a masked U.S. citizen's name.
Sure, the number is relevant, but what I hope the American people will realize is the number is important, but the culture behind it is, in fact, more important. The training, the rigor, the discipline. We are obsessive about FISA and the FBI for reasons I hope make sense to this committee, but everything that's FISA has to be labeled in such a way to warn people, this is FISA. We treat this in a special way. So we can get you the number, but I want to assure you the culture of the FBI and the NSA around how we treat U.S. person information is obsessive, and I mean that in a good way.
Director Comey, I am not arguing with you, and I do agree the culture is important. But if there are 100 people who have the ability to unmask and the knowledge of a previously masked name, then that's 100 different potential sources of investigation. And the smaller the number is, the easier your investigation is. So the number is relevant. I concede the culture is relevant. NSA, FBI, what other U.S. government agencies have the authority to unmask a U.S. citizen's name?
Well, I think all agencies that collect information pursuant to FISA have what are called standard minimization procedures, which are approved by the FISA court that govern how they will treat U.S. person information. So I know the NSA does, I know the CIA does, obviously the FBI does. I don't know for sure beyond that.
How about the Department of how about Maine Justice?
I mean, Maine Justice, I think, does have standard minimization procedures.
All right, so that's 4. The NSA, FBI, CIA, Maine Justice. Does the White House have the authority to unmask a U.S. citizen's name?
I think other elements of the government that are consumers of our products can ask the collectors to unmask. The unmasking resides with those who collected the information. And so if Mike Rogers' folks collected something and they send it to me in a report and it says U.S. person number 1, and it's important for the FBI to know who that is, our request will go over. They don't on their own collect, and so they can't on their own unmask. I got that about right?
Yeah, that's correct.
I guess what I'm getting at, Director Comey, is you say it's vital, you say it's critical, you say it's indispensable. We both know it's a threat to the reauthorization of 702 later on this fall. And oh, by the way, it's also a felony punishable by up to 10 years. So how would you begin your investigation, assuming for the sake of argument that a U.S. citizen's name appeared in the Washington Post and the New York Times unlawfully? Where would you begin that investigation?
Well, I'm not going to talk about any particular investigation.
That's why I said in theory.
You would start by figuring out, so who are the suspects? Who touched the information that you've concluded ended up unlawfully in the newspaper, and start with that universe, and then use investigative tools and techniques to see if you can eliminate people or include people as more serious suspects.
Do you know whether Director Clapper knew the name of the U.S. citizen that appeared in the New York Times and Washington Post?
I can't say in this forum because, again, I don't want to confirm that there was classified information in the newspaper.
Would he have access to an unmasked name?
In some circumstances, sure. He was the Director of National Intelligence, but I'm not talking about the particular.
Would Director Brennan have access to an unmasked U.S. citizen's name?
In some circumstances, yes.
Would National Security Advisor Susan Rice have access to an unmasked U.S. citizen's name?
I think yes, in general, and any other National Security Advisor would, I think, as a matter of their ordinary course of their business.
Would former White House Advisor Ben Rhodes have access to an unmasked U.S. citizen's name?
I don't know the answer to that.
Would former Attorney General Loretta Lynch have access to an unmasked U.S. citizen's name?
In general, yes, as would any Attorney General.
So that would also include Acting AG Sally Yates?
Same answer.
Did you brief President Obama on, well, I'll just ask you, did you brief President Obama on any calls involving Michael Flynn?
I'm not going to get into either that particular case, that matter, or any conversations I had with the President, so I can't answer that.
Well, Director Comey, there's been some speculation this morning on motive. I'm not all that interested in motive. First of all, it's really hard to prove. Secondarily, you never have to prove it. But I get that people want to know. I get the jury always wants to know why. I think you and I can agree there are a couple of reasons that you would not have to unlawfully, feloniously disseminate classified material. It certainly wasn't done to help an ongoing criminal investigation because you already had the information, didn't you?
Again, I can't answer in the context of this particular matter.
How about in theory? Is there something a reporter would have access to that the head of the FBI would not?
It's hard for me to answer. I would hope not when it relates to the FBI.
I would hope not too, since it's part of our surveillance programs. I would hope that you had access to everything as the head of the world's premier law enforcement agency. I would hope that you had it all. So if you had it all, the motive couldn't have been to help you because you already had it. And Admiral Rogers, the motive couldn't have been to help you because you already had it. So in the universe of possible motives for the felonious dissemination of classified material, we could rule out wanting to help the intelligence communities and the law enforcement communities. Those are two motives that are gone now. That leaves some more nefarious motives. Is the investigation into the leak of classified information, has it begun yet?
I can't say because I don't want to confirm that that was classified information.
Well, I don't want to quarrel with you, Director Comey, and I do understand that you cannot ordinarily confirm or deny the existence of an investigation. But you did it this morning citing DOJ policy given the gravity of the fact pattern. Would you not agree that surveillance programs that are critical, indispensable, vital to our national security, some of which are up for reauthorization this fall, that save American lives and prevent terrorist attacks, also rises to the level of important?
I think those programs are vital, and leaks of information collected for statements should be taken very, very seriously. What I don't ever want to do is compound what bad people have done and confirm something that's in the newspaper, because sometimes the newspaper gets it right. There's a whole lot of wrong information allegedly about classified activities that's in the newspaper. We don't call them and correct them either. That's another big challenge, but we just don't go anywhere near it because we don't want to help and compound the offense that was committed.
I understand that, Director Comey, and I'm trying really hard not to get you to discuss the facts at bar. But some of the words that appeared in this public reporting include the word transcript, which has a very unique use in the matters that you and I are discussing this morning. That is a very unique use of that word. Wiretap has a very specific meaning. The name of a U.S. citizen that was supposed to statutorily be protected is no longer protected. So some of this reporting, let's assume 90% of it is inaccurate. That other 10% is still really, really important. And to the extent that you can rely on the dates in either the Washington Post or the New York Times, we are talking about February of this year is when the reporting first took place. So we're a month and a half or 2 months into something that you and I agree is incredibly important and also happens to be a felony. So I'm just simply asking you to assure the American people, you've already assured them you take it really seriously. Can you assure them that it is going to be investigated?
I can't, but I hope people watching know how seriously we take leaks of classified information, but I don't want to confirm it by saying that we're investigating it. And I'm sorry I have to draw that line. I just think that's the right way to be.
Well, I'm not going to argue with you, Director Comey, but it is, we're going to discuss a lot of important things today. Whether Russia attempted to influence our democratic process is incredibly important. Whether they sought to influence it is a separate, incredibly important. Our U.S. response, incredibly important. Some of that may rise to the level of a crime. Some of it does not rise to the level of crime. One thing you and I agree on is the felonious dissemination of classified material most definitely is a crime. So I would ask you, and I understand some of the procedures that you are up against, I would humbly ask you to seek authority from whomever you need to seek authority from. Because I'm going to finish the same way I started. This is an agreement between the American people and its government. We, the American people, give certain powers to government to keep us safe. And when those powers are misused, and the motive is not criminal investigations or national security, then I'll bet you my fellow citizens are rethinking their side of the equation. Because that U.S. citizen could be them next time. It could be you. It could be me. It could be anyone until we start seriously investigating and prosecuting what Congress thought was serious enough to attach a 10-year felony to. With that, I would yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Can I just add a response to what you said? I agree with you, Mr. Gowdy. Two things folks at home should know. First, An unauthorized disclosure of FISA is an extraordinarily unusual event, so be assured we're going to take it very seriously because our trust with the American people and the federal judges that oversee our work is vital. And second, that this conversation has nothing to do with 702. Folks often mix them together. 702 is about targeting non-U.S. persons overseas. Pursuant to the FISA statute, the FBI can apply to collect electronic surveillance in the United States, but it's a different thing from 702. The conversation you and I are just having is about this, which is vital and important, but I just didn't want to leave folks confused.
Director Comey, you are 100% correct, and I am 100% correct in saying that that is a distinction that doesn't make a difference to most of the people watching television. You are exactly correct. What we are reauthorizing this fall has nothing to do with what we are discussing other than it is another government program where the people consent to allow government to pursue certain things with the explicit promise it will be protected. So you're right, they're different. But in the eyes of people watching, it is the U.S. government officials leaking the name of a U.S. citizen, and if it can happen here, it is in jeopardy if we don't get this resolved.
Gentlemen, our time's expired. I'll yield 15 minutes to Mr. Schiff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to follow up with a few questions about Roger Stone that I had started with earlier before I pass it to my colleagues. Director Comey, are you aware that Roger Stone played a role in the Trump campaign?
I'm not going to talk about any particular person here today, Mr. Schiff.
I'm going to continue to ask these questions because, among other things, I want to make sure you are aware of these facts, whether you're able to comment on them or not. Have you read press reports where Mr. Stone proudly boasts of engaging in political dirty tricks?
To give you the same answer, sir.
I mentioned before that Mr. Stone was in direct communication with the creature of Russian GRU, Guccifer 2, and that's something the intelligence assessment talked about, the role of Guccifer 2. Mr. Stone, on August 17th, are you aware, received a communication from Guccifer 2 that said, quote, "I'm pleased to say that you are great. Please tell me if I can help you anyhow. It would be a great pleasure to me." Are you aware of that communication from essentially Russian GRU through Guccifer to Mr. Stone?
I have to give you the same answer.
Are you aware that Mr. Stone also stated publicly that he was in direct communication with Julian Assange and WikiLeaks?
Same answer.
Are you aware that Mr. Stone also claimed that he was in touch with an intermediary of Mr. Assange?
Same answer.
This question I think you can answer. Do you know whether the Russian intelligence services dealt directly with WikiLeaks or whether they too used an intermediary?
We assessed they used some kind of cutout. They didn't deal directly with WikiLeaks, in contrast to DC Leaks and Guccifer 2.0.
In early October, are you aware that Mr. Stone tweeted, "I have total confidence that my hero Julian Assange will educate the American people soon"? Are you aware of that tweet?
I'm back to my original same answer.
And are you aware that it was only days later that WikiLeaks released the Podesta emails?
Same answer.
I'm going to yield now to Mr. Himes.
Thank you, Mr. Schiff. I note that we're going through the 90-minute mark in this hearing, so let me step back a second and just review the topics because there's a lot on the table. I think my friends on the Republican side will get no argument from this side on the importance of investigating, prosecuting leaks. Leaks are a threat to our national security, whether they're perpetrated by Edward Snowden, whether they're perpetrated by people outside the White House, or perhaps, as we have seen in the last 60 days, maybe from people inside the White House. But, Mr. Comey, if I can use your phrase, intense public interest, there is intense public interest in the fact that our new president will attack anyone and everyone. He will attack the cast of Hamilton. He will attack Chuck Schumer. He will attack our allies, Mexico, Australia, Germany. He will attack Nazism and with Nazism. But there's one person and one country which is immune, which is inoculated from any form of presidential attack, no matter what the behavior. No matter if there's a violation of the INF nuclear treaty, no matter if Vladimir Putin kills political opponents, the new president defends, obfuscates, does not attack. and the people around the president, Michael Flynn, Jeff Sessions, Carter Page, Paul Manafort, have an odd connection to Russia, a series of odd connections. We all campaign. I don't think any of our campaign people have connections with a foreign power, much less one that is an adversary of the United States. And further, apart from these weird links, without exception, the individuals I quoted have dissembled or misled, maybe even lied about the nature of those connections until the political pressure has gotten to a point where they have been fired or recused in the case of the Attorney General. So I want to look briefly at one of these individuals. And Director Comey, I understand your constraints, but let me ask a couple of questions regardless. Paul Manafort, who is Roger Stone's business partner and Trump's former campaign manager, I want to ask a few questions about him. First, Director Comey, can you tell me what the Foreign Agents Registration Act is?
Sure, not in an expert way, but it's a statute that requires people who are acting as agents of a non-U.S. government to register with the United States.
Right. So the National Security Division of the Department of Justice writes, this is their manual, the purpose of FARA, as it is known, is to ensure that the U.S. government and the people of the United States are informed of the source of information and the identity of persons attempting to influence U.S. public opinion, policy, and laws, unquote. Would you agree that guarding against foreign espionage or foreign influence measures falls under this heading?
Yes.
In general, is willful violation or failure to register pursuant to this law in some circumstances a crime?
I believe it is. I'm not an expert on FARA, but I believe it is.
And it could lead certainly to counterintelligence concerns, right?
Yes.
Now, Paul Manafort, as reported in the New York Times and other outlets, and his deputy Rick Gates ran a campaign in Washington to lobby government officials and push positive press coverage of pro-Russian Ukrainian officials. Paul Manafort began officially working for former Ukrainian President Yanukovych at least as far back as 2007, according to the Washington Post. The lobbying was only discovered by Ukraine's new National Anti-Corruption Bureau, which found secret ledgers in Kiev indicating almost $13 million in undisclosed cash payments from Ukrainian government coffers to Paul Manafort for lobbying done between 2007 and 2012 for Mr. Yanukovych. Director Comey, did Paul Manafort ever register as a foreign agent under FARA?
That's not something I can comment on.
Whether he registered or not is not something that you can comment on?
No.
Okay. Paul Manafort was, however, Donald Trump's campaign manager in July of 2016, correct?
Mr. Himes, I really don't want to get into answering questions about any individual U.S. person. So
okay.
It's obvious from the public record, but I don't want to start down the road of answering questions about somebody.
Okay. Well, I think the facts would show that he never did register. But as the ranking member pointed out, it perhaps should come as no surprise that the Republican platform, which was drafted at the Republican convention in July of 2016, underwent a pretty significant change with respect to the American response to Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine and their aggression in that country. It appears, from our standpoint, that we had perhaps somebody who should have registered under FARA pulling the strings there. There's more, though, and I don't know how much you'll be able to comment on this, but I want to just explore for a second the nature of the Russian government, because oftentimes the question becomes, was there contact with Russian officials? And I want to read you a brief quote from a book on Putin's government. This is by Professor Karen. Coate democratic system being pulled down by history, accidental autocrats, popular inertia, bureaucratic incompetence, or poor Western advice. I conclude that from the beginning, Putin and his circle sought to create an authoritarian regime ruled by a close-knit cabal who used democracy for decoration rather than direction. Mr. Comey, is it fair to say that the line that exists in the United States between government officers and government officials is blurred in Russia? That there may be oligarchs or other individuals who on the surface appear to be private citizens but who have connections to this close-knit cabal, who might be agents of influence or might be doing the Kremlin's bidding in contact with others?
That's fair to say, and one of our counterintelligence missions is to try to understand who are those people and are they acting on behalf of the Russian government, those Russian citizens.
Is it generally true that there is a category of Russian oligarchs that are likely part of this close-knit cabal?
In a general sense.
And if they go way back with Vladimir Putin, do the chances increase that they might be connected with the KGB, as asserted by Professor Dawisha?
The longevity of the association can be a consideration.
And the KGB was the Russian intelligence service under the Soviet Union, right?
Correct.
And the Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union.
Correct.
Right. I'll just observe, Rinat Akhmetov, a steel and iron ore magnate or oligarch, is the richest man in Ukraine and a strong Putin ally. He was the one who reportedly recommended Paul Manafort to Yanukovych. Mr. Comey, last set of questions for me. I have a report that appeared in CNN yesterday. The headline is, former Trump campaign chief Paul Manafort wanted for questioning in Ukraine corruption case. And I raise this with you because the story is told of Paul Manafort acting on behalf of Ukraine's former justice minister Alexander Lavrinovich, who was the justice minister under the previous pro-Russian regime, who, and I'll just read a segment from this story here, who was involved in jailing the former prime minister, Timoshenko, who was the main political rival of the Kremlin-backed President Viktor Yanukovych, whom Manafort advised until he was deposed in 2014. Timoshenko was released from jail at the same time that Yanukovych was ousted. Many saw her sentencing as politically motivated by the pro-Russian government. In response to the deteriorating international climate, Ukrainian prosecutors say Manafort drafted a public relations strategy that included hiring Skadden Arps, an American law firm, to review the Timoshenko case and show the conviction had a sound legal basis. The story goes on to talk about the transfer of over $1 million, potentially illegally, from Ukrainian coffers to Skadden Arps. And the reason I bring all this up with you is because the story also says, and it appears to have been confirmed by the Department of Justice, that the current Ukraine regime, hardly a friend of the Russians and very much targeted by the Russians, has made 7 requests to the United States government for assistance under the MLA treaty in securing the assistance of Paul Manafort as part of this anti-corruption case. And in fact, the story says that you were presented personally with a letter asking for that assistance. So my question, Director Comey, is that all true? Have you been asked to provide assistance to the current Ukrainian government with respect to Paul Manafort? And how do you intend to respond to that request?
That's not something I can comment on. I can say generally we have a very strong relationship and cooperation in the criminal and national security areas with our Ukrainian partners, but I can't talk about the particular matter.
The story says that the DOJ confirmed that there have been requests for assistance on this matter. You can't go as far as confirming that, in fact, there have been these requests made?
If they've done that, I would need them to do it again. I can't comment on it.
Okay. Well,
And I yield to Terry Sewell.
Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. My questions this morning really revolve around the resignation of the former National Security Advisor, Michael Flynn. Director Comey, much has been made about Russia's historical interference with political elections around the world, meant to cause discord and disunity, especially in Western alliances. Does the FBI generally assume that Russian ambassadors to the United States, like Ambassador Kislyak, are at least overtly collecting intelligence on influential Americans, especially political leaders?
Ms. Sewell, that's not something I can answer in an open setting.
Am I right that in the Russian playbook, that it's in the Russian playbook to use diplomats and business people and Russian intelligence officers, whether declared or not, to collect intelligence on influential Americans for the purpose of affecting U.S. policy?
I can answer as a general matter. Nation states that are adversaries of the United States use traditional intelligence officers sometimes use intelligence officers operating under diplomatic cover, use people we call co-optees, maybe private citizens, students, academics, business people. All manner of human beings can be used in an intelligence collection operation, but I'm not going to talk about the particular.
Would someone like Ambassador Kislyak play that type of role for Russia?
Yeah, I can't say here.
The declassified January Intelligence Community Assessment Report that your agency helped to draft, the report that's entitled Assessing Russian Activities and Intentions in the Recent U.S. Elections, specifically states that, quote, since the Cold War, Russian intelligence efforts related to the United States elections have primarily focused on foreign intelligence collections that could help Russian leaders understand a new U.S. administration's plans and priorities, end quote. So knowing what we know about Russia's efforts and the role of the Russian ambassador, Director Comey, would you be concerned if any one of your agents had a private meeting with the Russian ambassador?
If an FBI agent had a private meeting with a Russian government employee of any kind, it would be concerning. And I assume by private, one that's not disclosed or part of their operational activity.
That's
yes.
right.
Yes.
And would you expect that agent to report that meeting?
Yes.
Admiral Rogers, a similar question. Would you be concerned if one of your intelligence officers had a private meeting with the Russian ambassador? And would you expect that intelligence officer to report that meeting?
Disclosures of interactions with foreign governments is a requirement for all our employees, to include myself, for example.
I ask these questions because on at least 4 occasions that I can count, Mr. Flynn, a 3-star general and a former intelligence officer, someone with influence over the U.S. policy, and someone with knowledge of state secrets, and the incoming national security advisor communicated with and met with the Russian ambassador and failed to disclose it. So I ask you, directors, if you wouldn't stand for your own staff to do this, why should we, the American people, accept Michael Flynn doing it?
Ms. Sewell, I'll let Mike Rogers take it next, but I can't speak to what the disclosure obligations are for other people in the government, so it's hard for me to answer that. I can answer, and I answered, I hope accurately, with respect to one of the FBI's special agents.
And I likewise would answer the same way in terms of the NSA.
Gentleman's time has expired. I'll yield myself 15 minutes. Director Comey, you announced this morning that there'll be an investigation into Trump associates, possible, and President Trump and anyone around the campaign and any association with the Russian government. If this committee or anyone else for that matter, someone from the public, comes with information to you about the Hillary Clinton campaign or their associates or someone from the Clinton Foundation, will you add that to your investigation? They have ties to Russian intelligence services, Russian agents. Would that be something of interest to you?
People bring us information about what they think is improper and lawful activity of any kind, we will evaluate it. Not just in this context. Folks send us stuff all the time. They should keep doing that. Do
you think it's possible that the Russians would not be trying to infiltrate Hillary Clinton's campaign, get information on Hillary Clinton, and try to get to people that are around that campaign or the Clinton Foundation?
I'm not prepared to comment about the particular campaigns, but the Russians in general are always trying to understand who the future leaders might be and what levers of influence there might be on them.
I just hope that if information does surface about the other campaigns, not even just Hillary Clinton's, but any other campaigns, that you would take that serious also if the Russians were trying to infiltrate those campaigns around them.
Of course.
Thanks for being here. Admiral Rogers, you mentioned analytic standards earlier in the conversation. Are those standards the same for all intelligence analysts across the various agencies?
There's a broad set of intelligence community promulgated standards for all of us, and then there are specific issues associated, for example, with a particular authority that you're using to collect the information in the first place.
So, Jim, the same thing with your agency, your analysts would have similar type of standards?
Correct. That's one of the really good things that's happened since 9/11, especially since 2004, is the adoption of a common set of tradecraft provisions.
So I'm a CPA, and we have generally accepted accounting standards, which are promulgated across a variety of things. Are those same standards publicly promulgated, or but generally assimilated through all of your analysts, I would assume, would have some sort of a test that they know those standards?
I think the specifics of the IC promulgated standards are classified, but I could take that one for the record, sir.
When the IC attributes a hacking to a particular actor, you do that through generally forensic evidence. But when it comes to trying to determine intent of foreign leaders, can you walk us through how the NSA does that or the FBI does that?
We assess the range of information that we've collected in an attempt to generate understanding as to not only what has occurred, but part of the intelligence profession is also trying to understand why, what was the intent. We'll use the range of information we have available to us while we're primarily a single source organization. It's one reason why organizations like CIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, which take multiple sources to try to put together a complete picture. So we're just one component of a broader effort.
Dr. Comey, anything different than that?
No, it's about putting together a puzzle. Sometimes from forensics alone, you can get a pretty good indication as to what they must be intending to accomplish. Other times it requires human sources and additional signals intelligence to give you that sense.
So both of you agree, though, it's rarely a precise art or a precise science of determining intent of any foreign leader.
That's correct. All of intelligence
Judgment.
work requires judgment. That's at the center of it.
But I will say in some cases, it's a much clearer case than in others. There are
That depends
some
on,
places
that depends, I
where it's
guess,
very
on the
clear.
sources you have inside a particular foreign leader's shop.
I'm not going to get into the specifics.
Well, it's just in general. If you had somebody who's next door neighbor, never mind. Pivoting to the January 6th intelligence community assessment, both your agencies agree with the assessment that the Russians' goal was to undermine the public faith in the U.S. democratic process. Is that still your assessment?
Yes.
Yes.
Same assessment said that the Russians' goal was wanted to denigrate Secretary Clinton and harm her electability and potential presidency, and that Putin wanted to discredit Secretary Clinton because he publicly blamed her since 2011 for inciting mass protests against his regime in late 2011 and early 2012. You both still agree with that assessment?
Yes.
Yes.
And then finally, Admiral Rogers, that assessment went on to say that President Putin and the Russian government aspire to help President, I guess it had been candidate Trump at the time, but President-elect Trump's election chances when possible by discrediting Secretary Clinton. You had a lower
Confidence
level. Is that still the case?
Yes, sir.
Can you tell the group why you were?
I'm not going to get into the specifics in unclassified form, but for me, it boiled down to the level and nature of the sourcing on that one particular judgment was slightly different to me than the others.
All right.
To be clear, Mr. Conaway, we all agreed with that judgment.
We all agreed
Right.
with
Yeah.
the judgment.
But you really agreed, and he almost really agreed.
Not terms our folks use, but I get
Not a
it.
term of art. I got you. Director Comey, in terms of laying out those three assessments and whether or not the IC was consistent in its view of those three assessments across the entire campaign, can we walk through kind of the FBI's walk down that path? As of early December of 16, did the FBI assess that the active measures were to undermine by the Russians were to undermine the faith in the U.S. democratic process? Did you come to that conclusion by early December?
I think that's right, December of last year.
16, yes, sir.
I think we were at that point, yes.
And then active measures conducted against Secretary Clinton to denigrate her, hurt her campaign, and also undermine her presidency.
Correct.
All right. And then the conclusion that active measures were taken specifically to help President Trump's campaign. You had that by early December. You already had that conclusion?
Correct. That they wanted to hurt our democracy, hurt her, help him. I think all three we were confident in at least as early as December.
Okay. The paragraph that's given me a little concern there in terms of just the timing of when all of that occurred, because I'm not sure if we went back and got that exact same January assessment 6 months earlier, it would have looked as developed a clear preference for President-elect Trump. Any idea when that clear preference in the analysis, when did that get into the lexicon of when you talking back and forth among yourselves on a classified basis?
I don't know for sure, but I think that was a fairly easy judgment for the community. Putin hated Secretary Clinton so much that the flip side of that coin was he had a clear preference for the person running against the person he hated so much.
Yeah, and that might work on Saturday afternoon when my wife's Red Raiders are playing the Texas Longhorns. She really likes the Red Raiders. But all the rest of the time, I mean, the logic is that because he really didn't like the candidate Clinton, that he automatically liked Trump. That assessment's based on what?
Well, it's based on more than that, but part of it is, and we're not going to get into the details of it here, but part of it is the logic. Whoever the Red Raiders are playing, you want the Red Raiders to win. By definition, you want their opponent to lose.
I know, but this says that you wanted both of them, you wanted her to lose, wanted him to win. Is that
right? They're inseparable. Right? It's a two-person event.
I got you. So I'm just wondering when you decided you wanted him to win.
Well, logically, when he wanted her to lose, he wanted her.
No, I'm not talking about him. Putin. I got that. But the question is, when in this clear preference? Well, then let me finish up then. So we go through that sentence about the clear preference for Donald Trump, and we don't know exactly when you guys decided that was the case. Then it says, when it appeared to Moscow that Secretary Clinton was likely to win the election, the Russian influence campaign then focused on undermining her expected presidency. So, and then the next sentence says the Russian government aspired to help President-elect Trump election chances. So when did they not think she was going to win?
Well, the assessment of the intelligence community was as the summer went on and the polls appeared to show that Secretary Clinton was going to win, the Russians sort of gave up and simply focused on trying to undermine her. It's your Red Raiders. You know they're not going to win, so you kind of hope key people on the other team get hurt so they're not such a tough opponent down the road. And so there was at some point...
So you believe that the FBI was consistent through early December and on that was the case, that they assessed that they really wanted Trump to win it and were working to have him win and her lose?
Yes, our analysts had a view that I don't believe changed from late fall through to the report on January 6th, that it had those three elements.
All right. So then on December the 9th, well in advance of the January 6th deal, the Washington Post put out an article. Their lead sentence was that this, and again, CIA, they're not here today, but in the 2016 election to help Donald Trump win the presidency rather than to undermine the confidence in the electoral system. Rather than just undermine it. They don't mention Ms. Clinton at all. And then it says to help Trump get elected, the U.S. senior briefed on the intelligence position, the U.S. official briefed on the intelligence presentation to U.S. senators said that's the consensus view. How much did this is written by a guy named Adam Entos, Elaine something, and Greg Miller. Did they help draft the January 6th document for the Intel Committee?
I'm sorry?
Did those writers from the Washington Post help you write the January 6th assessment?
No, they did not.
I wonder how they got almost the exact language on December the 9th.
Yeah, it hadn't been written yet. I don't know. This is the peril of trying to comment on newspaper articles that purport to report classified information. I can't say much about them. They're often wrong.
Yep. You mentioned earlier in one of our hearings that when anybody uses I can't talk because I'm bound by position of anonymity or whatever, that really is code for breaking the law. Generally, right? When somebody says, I'm talking to a reporter, I'm just classifying secret information, you can't tell, the reporter can't tell who it is because, as Mr. Gowdy was saying earlier, speaking on a condition of anonymity, that really should be interpreted because I'm breaking the law and I don't want to be outed. Is that a fair statement?
Sometimes. I think there are other motives behind people requesting anonymity, but that can be one of them.
So it's your statement to us that the FBI was consistent in its assessment that they denigrate the U.S. electoral process, hurt Hillary and her potential candidacy, and concurrent across all of that, that they intended to help Trump. That's your testimony this morning?
Correct.
Thank you. Yield back.
Mr. King.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If you could yield me a few minutes into the next round. So I'll just start with this, make the comment. First of all, let me thank Director Comey and Admiral Rogers for being here today and for what I believe has been the cooperation you've always given this committee. So thank you very much for that and for your service. Director Comey, I think, we're in a predicament here today. I understand your situation where you can't comment on the investigation, and yet we can have various scenarios laid out which could go on for months and months and months without anyone being able to disprove them until the investigation is completed. I would just like to use the example. For instance, we could have said that in 2012, President Obama was overheard on a microphone telling Medvedev that if I'm reelected, tell Vladimir we can work out better arrangements. We know that he ridiculed candidate Romney in the 2012 election when Romney said that he thought Russia was still a threat. And then in 2013, we saw that basically President Obama invited the Russians into Syria when they've been pretty much removed from the Middle East 40 years before. And also, as far as aid to Ukraine, as far as I recall, the Obama administration always refused to give lethal aid to Ukraine. And it can be argued that the Republican platform in 2016 was actually stronger than the Democratic platform on that. So again, if there was an investigation going on of the Obama administration, we could lay out all these scenarios and say, well, that proves something, or it might prove something. And until the investigation was completed, that type of almost possibly slanderous comments could be made. So I would just, again, if I'm not asking you to hurry the investigation along, you have to do what you have to do. But I guess I could ask you just in the remaining moments I have in this round. I know that, I guess it was just 2 weeks ago, that Director Clapper said that as far as he knows, all the evidence he's seen, there's no evidence of any collusion at all between the Trump campaign and the Russians. Now, obviously, a detailed, exhaustive report was put out talking about Russian influence in the campaign. All of the intelligence apparatus had input into that. Do either you or Admiral Rogers have any reason to disagree with the conclusion of General Clapper that there's no evidence of collusion between the Russians and the Trump campaign?
Mr. King, it's not something I can comment on.
Likewise, I'm not going to comment on an ongoing investigation's conclusions.
But again, you're not going to disagree with General Clapper, you're just not going to comment. And the reason I'm pointing that out is that's sort of the situation, the other way around, that when you can't comment on something, often there's an inference out there that because the person's name is brought implied in that. So that's the problem. I'm not in any way being critical of either of you. I'm just saying this is a situation which I think can be damaging to the country and does advance the Russian interests of trying to destabilize democracy and cause a lack of confidence in our system. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. I recognize Mr. Schiff for 15 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have a couple of follow-up questions before I pass to Representative Sewell. It wasn't simply that the Russians had a negative preference against Secretary Clinton. They also had a positive preference for Donald Trump. Isn't that correct?
Correct.
And I want to ask you to say whether this is an accurate characterization of Mr. Trump. I won't put you in that spot. But would it be logical for the Kremlin to prefer a candidate that disparaged NATO to be President of the United States?
You're not going to put me in that spot, you said? I'm happy,
Yes.
I'm happy with that. I'm happy with that.
I'm not going to put you in the spot of answering whether this is an accurate characterization of Mr. Trump's views, but it would be logical for the Kremlin to want someone who had a dim view of NATO. Is that right?
All kidding aside, I don't think that's something I should be answering. I mean, that's beyond my responsibilities.
Well, what is the Russian view of NATO? Do they like NATO? Do they want to see NATO strong?
Well, again, I'm sure you have already spoken to people who are greater experts than I, but yeah, they don't like NATO. They think NATO encircles them and threatens them.
And would they have a preference for a candidate that expressed an openness to repealing the sanctions over Ukraine?
Again, I don't want to get into business of commenting on that. I know.
Well, then let me ask you this way, Director. Would they like to see the sanctions on Ukraine go away?
Yes.
Would they have a preference for a candidate who expressed open admiration for Putin?
And I hope you'll reformulate the question. Mr. Putin would like people who like him.
Would they have a preference for a candidate who encouraged Brexit and other departures from Europe? Would they like to see more Brexits?
Yes.
And have the Russians in Europe demonstrated a preference for business people as political leaders with the hope that they can entangle them in financial interests, or that they may allow their financial interests to take precedence over the interests of the countries in Europe they represent?
In our joint report, we recount that the Russians, that President Putin has expressed a preference for business leaders in leading other governments, and mentions Gerhard Schroeder and I'm going to forget one. Berlusconi, because he believes they're people that are more open to negotiation, easier to deal with.
At this point, let me yield to Representative Sewell.
I'd like to continue my questioning, the line of questioning on Michael Flynn. I'm sure you can understand my concern that Mr. Flynn not only failed to disclose the contacts with the Russian ambassador, but he said he did not remember whether he discussed sanctions against Russia with that ambassador. And I find that really hard to believe. And wouldn't you think that at the height of our concern about Russian hacking, that Mr. Flynn would have remembered meeting with the Russian ambassador and would have told him to stop meddling in our affairs? But that didn't happen, did it?
So that's not something I can answer.
Not only did Mr. Flynn not remember talking to the Russian ambassador, and not only did he not remember what they talked about it. Now, Mr. Comey, do you think that Mr. Flynn's failure to disclose the communication and contact he had with the Russian ambassador and their topic of conversation, along with a blatant lie to Vice President Pence, meet the standard for an investigation by the FBI?
I have to give you the same answer. I'm not going to comment.
Now, I know, Director Comey, that you probably can't comment on this as well, but I think it's really important that we review a short timeline and that's based on press reportings, because we need to get this for the public record, I think. So on December 25th, 2016, Mr. Flynn reportedly exchanged text messages with the Russian ambassador. On December 28th, 2016, Mr. Flynn reportedly spoke on the phone with the Russian ambassador. By then, it was pretty clear that the Obama administration was going to take actions against Russia. On December 29th, 2016, Mr. Flynn reportedly spoke on the phone with the Russian ambassador again. That day, the Obama administration expelled 35 Russian operatives from the United States and announced new sanctions. We also know from press reportings that sometime in December, Mr. Flynn met in person with the Russian ambassador at Trump Tower, and that Mr. Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, was also there. The purpose of the meeting was to, quote, establish a line of communication, end quote, with the Kremlin. I should add that the White House and Mr. Flynn didn't disclose this December face-to-face meeting until this month. On January 12th, 2017, press reported that Mr. Flynn contacted the Russian ambassador again. And on January 15th, 2015, Vice President-elect Mike Pence stated on several Sunday morning shows regarding Mr. Flynn's conversation with the ambassador, quote, "What I can confirm, having spoken to him about it, is that those conversations that happened to occur around the time that the United States took action to expel diplomats had nothing whatsoever to do with those sanctions," end quote. On January 26th, the acting Attorney General Sally Yates reportedly told President Trump's White House counsel, who immediately told President Trump, that Mr. Flynn was vulnerable to Russian blackmail because of discrepancies between Vice President-elect Pence's public statement and Mr. Flynn's actual discussions. On February 10th, President Trump denied knowledge of this, telling reporters on Air Force One, quote, "I don't know about that," end quote, in response to questions about Mr. Flynn's conduct. The White House also publicly denied that Mr. Flynn and the Russian ambassador discussed sanctions. And of course, on February 13th, 2017, Mr. Flynn resigned as National Security Advisor. Now, Director Comey, all of these Given Russia's longstanding desire to cultivate relations with influential U.S. persons, isn't the American public right to be concerned about Mr. Flynn's conduct, his failure to disclose that contact with the Russian ambassador, his attempts to cover it up, and what looks like the White House's attempts to sweep this under the rug? Don't we as the American people deserve the right to know? And shouldn't our FBI investigate such claims?
I can't comment. I understand people's curiosity about our work and intense interest in it, and as Mr. King said, oftentimes speculation about it, but we can't do it well or fairly to the people we investigate if we talk about it, so I can't comment.
I'd like to turn to another topic about Mr. Flynn. His failure to disclose until pressured last week by my colleagues on the House Oversight and Government Relations Committee, Government Reforms Committee, payments he received from Russia for his 2015 trip to the 10th anniversary gala of RT, the Russian-owned propaganda media outlet. According to the January 2017 declassified IC assessment report, RT's criticism of the United States was, quote, the last facet of its broader and longstanding anti-U.S. messaging likely aimed at undermining viewers' trust in the U.S. democratic procedures, end quote. This January assessment points out that this was a strategy that Russia employed going back to before the 2012 elections, according to the IC assessment. So, Admiral Rogers, am I right that the RT is essentially owned by the Russian government? And how long has the intelligence community been looking at RT as an arm of the Russian government?
So we're certainly aware and have been for some period of time of the direct connections between the Russian government and RT individuals. We're aware of monetary flow and other things.
And how long have you known about that? A few months, a few years? I mean, how long has the United States?
Some number of years. I apologize, ma'am. I just don't know off the top of my head.
Aren't I right to assume then that the former director of DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, Mr. Flynn, would have been aware that RT's role as an anti-U.S. Russian propaganda outlet when he agreed to speak at their anniversary gala in 2015? Isn't it reasonable to assume that he would know?
I'm not in a position to comment on the knowledge of something else from another person, ma'am.
Director Comey, would it be unusual for a foreign government official to get paid by a foreign adversary to attend such an event? And would it be unusual and raise some questions at the FBI if that person failed to disclose the payments received for that trip?
I don't know in general, and as to the specific, I'm just not going to comment.
Yes, sir. I understand that you can't comment, but I'd like to read an exchange between Mr. Flynn and a Yahoo News correspondent from July 2016 regarding the event. The correspondent asked, were you paid for that event? Then there was back and forth for a bit, and then Mr. Flynn said, quote, yeah, I didn't take any money from Russia, if that's what you're asking me, end quote.